All right. Yeah.
Why was he banned from teaching?
About religion?
Yeah.
Some of this is alluded in the presentation, which is that he had some controversial views about religion. There's a little allusion to this even in our own text, where he talks about there's potential conflict between knowledge and religion. And one way that he's interpreted as dealing with this is essentially saying religion has its own sphere of knowledge, and then reason has its own sphere of understanding, but the two don't really relate to one another. And some people love that, some people hated it. And the king at the time hated it. So, yeah. Were there any other questions about stuff about his life or anything else that I may have missed? Yeah.
Now, Prussia at the time, that was a Protestant state. It wasn't Catholic.
That's right.
Okay.
He's Lutheran, and very devout Lutheran.
Yeah, I wonder what a Catholic would say about his religious ideas.
Yeah. I will say that his thinking has deeply influenced both Catholic and Protestant theology. And not so much what I just said there, to some extent. It's actually the stuff we're kind of doing today, which is, his general framework of epistemology has deeply influenced theology. It's really interesting. Of all the philosophers we've studied in this period, Descartes could give Kant a run for his money on this issue, but Kant, pretty much hands down, is the most influential thinker, period. He influenced everything. Whereas all these other guys up here, they've influenced a lot of things, right? Locke, he gave us democracy, right? Democracy, that's pretty important, right? American government, that's pretty big. Leibniz, calculus, that's pretty important in mathematics. Descartes gives us Cartesian coordinates in mathematics. He's given us a bunch of other things that are relevant to science and math and philosophy. But Kant does it all. There's not a single major area of philosophy that Kant is not one of the most important. His writings are not among the most important writings. Whether it's philosophy of beauty, music, philosophy science, philosophy of epistemology, mind, free will, he's done it all. Ethics is a really big one. If any of you are familiar with Kant prior to coming in here, it was probably because you read a little bit of his ethics. So Kant is a really big deal. Also want to say before I get too deep into our presentation, just that you should be very proud of yourselves being where you are at this point in the semester. You have read a lot of really hard philosophy. And you've traced through some of the most interesting thinkers in Western Europe. And you've seen a nice little conversation, if you will, started with Descartes. So Descartes tries to start us off by convincing us of innate ideas, thinking that some kind of pure rationalism is the basis for all of our thoughts and ideas and knowledge. Leibniz kind of continues in that tradition, but in a very different way. Leibniz thinks it's all ideas, but he thinks reality is also all ideas, that the physical world is a kind of illusion. Then we turn to Locke, and Locke totally turned against all that. And Locke said everything is through experience, and he wanted to say there's a difference between the substances and their primary qualities that really exist, and then the secondary qualities and the things that exist in your mind that represent them. Then Berkeley came along and said, you can't do that, you can't separate the two, you only can have ideas in the mind. And then Hume comes along and basically says you can't have any knowledge of anything. So here we come to Kant, and he's going to try to respond in a way to what Hume was doing. Not a lot of people read Hume or took Hume very seriously. Kant read Hume and said, that's a serious problem. We have to come up with an answer to that. So, the Critique of Pure Reason the first edition was 1781. There's a second edition that was published in 1787. if you notice in your book, there's these marginal notes about page numbers with like A and B. A corresponds to the first edition, B to the second edition. They're not. I don't see a huge difference in the first and second edition, but I'm not a Kant expert. But I just see the second edition as sort of expanding and further explaining the key ideas he already put in there. What we're going to be looking for is how he puts forward this revolutionary view of epistemology or knowledge. In our reading, one of the things is going to be the focus on reason or thought itself. This is one of the key parts of what we're doing in this class, is trying to understand what thinking or thought is in itself. He's not going to argue for there being innate ideas, but rather something more like what we'll call innate categories. And this will make more sense at the end. And finally, the unique part of his approach is including a role for what is called synthetic a priori knowledge. Once again, that'll be clearer as we get through all of this tonight. So, to start us off, let's talk about what does he mean by conducting a critique of pure reason. So let's open up to page 718. I want to start reading the second line from the top on the left column. And as we read this, he's going to be telling us about what is a critique of pure reason. And let's just kind of see what you take from this. So he says, alright, it is a call to reason to take on once again the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-cognition, and to set up a tribunal that will make reason secure in its rightful claims and will dismiss all baseless pretensions not by fiat but in accordance with reason's eternal and immutable laws. This tribunal is none other than the critique of pure reason itself. By critique of pure reason, however, I do not mean a critique of books and systems, but I mean the critique of our faculty of reason as such, in regard to all cognitions after which reasons may strive independently of all experience. Hence, I mean by it the decision as to whether a metaphysics as such is possible or impossible, and the determination of its sources as well as its range and limits, all on the basis of principles. There's actually a few different things you can take from this. What are some of the things that you see in that passage that he's telling us is the critique of pure reason? Yeah.
Well, when he's talking about pure reason, he even mentions it has to be independent of all experiences. So when he's talking about reason, he's not going to be talking about any of the ways we get reason, like through books or through systems. So.
Good. So one of the key things, this is what reason is in and of itself, not reason mixed with experience. And that's that's one of the key things from the whole thing you should take. What else do you take from this? What else are we going to be getting at when we talk about a critique of pure reason? Yeah.
Well, I kind of interpret it as it seems like he was kind of talking about instincts, kind of you don't have to experience them before you just kind of know what you're supposed to do, kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a kind of immediate nature of these things. And that's brought out in some of the other passages as well, but it's not... There's sort of a process you have to go through to understand what they are, but they operate immediately. here are a few things I came up with. It's the study of self-cognition. How thinking itself works. Not how... So once again, not how your thought... He doesn't want you to analyze like the thought of a chair, or the thought of a tree, or the thought of love, or the thought of God. He wants you to think... It's like thinking about thought. Period. So it's trying to understand what thought is in and of itself. We're going to be looking at reasons, what he calls eternal and immutable laws. To know reason as it is, independent of all experience. And one of the things that comes out from this is whether or not metaphysics is possible. The thing that we get from Hume is that basically all attempts to know anything is impossible. That Hume says it's because of the inability to reason on the basis of cause and effect, that trying to make any kind of inference to anything outside of your mind is impossible, and metaphysics would be included in that. So he's trying to fix the problem that Hume gave us, and thereby show, hopefully, that metaphysics is something that's possible. Trying to understand the way the world really is something we can actually do. Any questions about this? Another way to kind of understand what he's doing in the Critique of Pure Reason is to look at this analogy he gives on 721, where he compares himself, quite modestly, to Copernicus. Anybody who goes around saying that they are like Copernicus is not being modest. So you know how Copernicus was, right? Copernicus was trying to give us an answer to really strange phenomena in the sky. We were coming up with solar system models, and the assumption was always that the Earth was the center of our solar system. But you got really weird things, like they're trying to track the motion of Mars or Venus, or a lot of the planets in our solar system. You'll notice that it doesn't just go across the night sky in a nice, even, straight line, like you would expect if the Earth was the center of the universe. What happens? Mars kind of goes, and then it comes back, and then it keeps going, and then it comes back. Like, that's really weird. Why would Mars do that if the Earth is the center of the universe? Now, there were lots of scientists who gave very accurate mathematical models that explained the motions of these other planets and why they go around. Like, they thought that essentially the Earth was the center, and then Mars must just be sort of doing, circles around us. And you can model it that way, right? Copernicus came up with this revolutionary idea that said maybe the Earth, after all, isn't the center of our solar system. What if the Sun is, and we're all going around the Sun? That would explain in a much simpler way all the motions of these planets. We don't have to come up with these curly-Q rotations. We can get, they were called epicycles, we can just explain them with, nice, somewhat circular orbits. So by changing our orientation around one problem, we're able to solve something that seemed very complex with simplicity. In the same way, Kant is trying to do, he is very self-consciously comparing himself to Copernicus and saying, let me revolutionize the way, change our orientation here. If we change our orientation about epistemology, our theory of knowledge, then maybe we'll get amazing and better results just like Copernicus did with the solar system. So he says, thus far it has been assumed that all our cognition, like all of our thought, must conform to objects. So I think, before I go on here, what he means by that is, like everybody we have read up till now, Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, have said if we're going to have knowledge of the world, the way it works is essentially that your mind has to change and represent the way the world is. And if your mind doesn't change in the right way, if your mind doesn't represent the world as it actually is, well then you fail to have knowledge. So thus far it's been assumed that all of our thoughts have to conform to objects that are external to us. Otherwise, we can't have knowledge. Then he says, on that presupposition, however, all our attempts to establish something about them a priori And a priori, maybe as a starter, we can say that just means apart from experience. All of our attempts to establish something about them a priori by means of concepts through which our cognition would be expanded have come to nothing. In other words, on this kind of approach, where we have to say that in order to have knowledge of the world, our minds have to conform to the way the world is, we can't know much. We haven't been very successful. Let us, therefore, try to find out whether we shall not make better progress in the problems of metaphysics if we assume, here's the game changer, that objects must conform to our cognition. In other words, what if the world has to conform to the way we think? All this time we've been thinking our minds had to conform to the way the world is in and of itself. But what if the world has to change to be a certain way to make it to meet our minds? In other words, what if our minds shape the way the world is? If that's true, then we are able to have some kind of a priori means of understanding the way the world is, because the world would have to fit into certain structures of our mind. So, in this way, it makes possible greater knowledge. It overcomes certain kinds of skeptical concerns. The skeptical concern is, how do you know that your mind is actually matching up with the way the world is? His solution is to say, aha, the world has to change in order to be adequate for our minds. That your mind plays some role in shaping reality. So that's his Copernican revolution. Stop thinking that that your mind has to passively receive the world and change in order to represent reality accurately. Oh no. Your mind is actively involved in making the world the way it is, and for that reason, you can know the way the world is. Well, I have more to say about this, but I just want to make sure that I'm impressing upon you the significance of this shift. Another thing to think about is the way his philosophy is often called transcendental idealism. And I'm not going to read all this, but if you can find some of these ideas where I've marked up here, 722, 723. It's transcendental in the sense that all thought involves a kind of a priori intuition. A priori, once again, meaning apart from experience. So he's going to say every thought that you have relies on some kind of addition that the mind adds to it. That your mind is supplying something that makes thought possible about things. We'll see about this. This is, at its most fundamental level, are two things that your mind supplies: space and time. I'll have a little bit more to say about those later tonight. So it's transcendental in the sense that thought involves this a priori intuition. That all thought involves an addition, a substantive and real addition that your mind gives it. The second part of this is the idealism. It's a dangerous word we've seen associated with Leibniz and with Berkeley. His idealism is different from theirs, thank goodness. That he is not saying that all reality is ideas. What he's saying is that the only thing we can know are ideas. But he believes that there is a world external to our world of ideas. So the only thing that we can think about, the only objects of thought, are what he calls phenomena, or appearances, or objects of experience. Those things are what we can know. Those are the things that we can think about. Knowledge of what he calls things in themselves, or a thing in itself, or the noumena, which is the way things exist apart from thought, that is impossible. Because for Kant, you're asking him to think about what is the way reality is apart from thought. That's impossible to think about, because the only way you can think about it is through thought. The difference, though, is that unlike Berkeley took that lesson to mean, therefore there is nothing apart from thought. Kant believes there is a reality apart from thought. It's just that the reality is not something that we can ever know. So in that sense, he's an idealist, in that all you can know are thoughts. Questions about what we mean by a transcendental idealism. Kant is one of these philosophers, by the way. It makes so much more sense after we get everything out on the table. So, in some ways, after I've talked about all this, and we get to the very end of class, it'll make more sense how this all comes together at once. It's almost like you need everything explained all at once, which, of course, we can't do. All right, this gets us to this next topic, the synthetic a priori. Before we can talk about synthetic a priori knowledge, we need to talk about the difference between what synthetic means and what a priori means. So, let's first talk about a priori. There are two categories of judgments, a priori judgments, a posteriori judgments. A priori judgments are those that are supposed to involve necessity and universality. So these kinds of claims. All triangles have three sides, all red things are colored things. These are a priori judgments because these are things that we think are necessarily true, meaning they couldn't have any other truth value than being true. And secondly, that they are universal, meaning that there's no exceptions to them. So all triangles have three sides. It's necessarily and universally true. All red things are colored things. It's necessarily and universally true. And a posteriori judgments then do not have necessity and universality. So a claim like my shirt is blue, or if I was tailoring it to today, my shirt is white, that there's nothing necessary or universal about such a claim. It could change. Is that all right? Question about a priori, a posteriori? So the next distinction is between analytic and synthetic. Let's take a look on page 724. On the right column here, I want to take a look right under Roman numeral 4 there. I'm going to read a little bit, and the question to think about as I'm reading is, what is the difference between analytic and synthetic claims? In all judgments in which we think the relation of a subject to the predicate, I here consider affirmative judgments only because the application to negative judgments afterwards is easy. This relation is possible in two ways. Either the predicate B belongs to the subject A as something that is covertly contained in this concept A, or B, though connected with concept A, lies quite outside it. In the first case, I call the judgment analytic, in the second, synthetic. Hence, affirmative analytic judgments are those in which the predicate's connection with the subject is thought by identity, whereas those judgments in which this connection is not thought with identity are to be called synthetic. Analytic judgments could also be called explicative, for they do not add anything to the concept of subject through the predicate. Rather, they only dissect the concept, breaking it up into its component concepts which had already been thought in it, although thought confusedly. Synthetic judgments, on the other hand, could be called expansive, for they do add to the concept of the subject a predicate that had not been thought in that concept at all, and could not have been extracted by any dissection. So what's the difference in the two? Yeah.
It's kind of like analytic is what it is kind of thing. It's very almost cut and dry in so many words, and then synthetic is kind of how your mind digests it and breaks it down into different things. It's kind of like more broken down and not as straight and cut forward.
Some of those things would apply. Some for something a little more specific. That's not bad.
I want to say that if it's analytic, just by understanding, I guess, the nature of what you're talking about is, then whatever your B is follows from the understanding of it directly. But that doesn't necessarily happen with synthetic. You may have to know additional information about it.
That's a good way to put it. That's a little more abstract. So the classic example of an analytic claim is one like a bachelor is unmarried. The concept of a bachelor contains within it the concept of being unmarried. So if you understand what it means to be a bachelor, then you know that whatever a bachelor is also unmarried. Because being unmarried is contained under the concept of being a bachelor. Whereas if I were to say bachelors are less than 10 feet tall, that's a synthetic claim. Because being less than 10 feet tall is not part of the concept of being a bachelor.
Wouldn't like synthetic judgments be like more how you perceive things? How like everyone perceives things?
This is traditionally what's been thought. So this is what everybody thought before Kant. I'm getting excited here. Analytic claims are, so let me get this up because I'm ready to move to the next slide, is the predicate is contained in the subject. So like all bachelors are unmarried. Why is that analytic? Because being unmarried is a concept contained in being a bachelor. All bodies are extended. That is analytic because what it means to be a body, to have a physical object, is to have extension. But a synthetic judgment would be where the predicate is connected to the subject. The two, like if it's a true judgment, then the predicate is actually connected to the subject, but it is not contained within it. So all bachelors are shorter than 8 feet tall. That might be true. I might have to raise the height up to account for some people. But let's say all bachelors are shorter than 11 feet tall. That's probably true. It's a synthetic judgment because being less than 8 feet tall, being less than 11 feet tall, is not included in the concept of being a bachelor. And Kant's example is all bodies are heavy. It might be true, actually, there's a sense in which this isn't true, but that bodies are heavy, but it's not because of what the nature of what a body is. To be a body is just to be an extended thing. You take, of course, an extended thing up into space, it no longer has any weight. So it wouldn't be true that all bodies are heavy. Now, to bring it all together where Sarah was going, prior to Kant, the big assumption was that there were only two kinds of truths: analytic a priori truths and synthetic a posteriori truths. Like it seems like the two categories just lined up with one another. So that, remember our good friend Leibniz and his truths of reason, or Hume and his relations of ideas? That was just an analytic a priori truth. Those would be things that are just true by definition. And once again, all bachelors are unmarried does the trick. Or all red things are colored things does the trick. That's just a matter of understanding the concepts involved tells you what they are. Kant tells us these do not expand our knowledge. All they do at best is clarify maybe confused or ideas we had about these things before, or they show us more clearly what the knowledge we already have is, but it doesn't really give us new knowledge in any way. So if I know that Travis is a bachelor, and then I deduce from that, therefore Travis is unmarried, I already knew that when I knew he was a bachelor. On the other side of this was the synthetic a posteriori truths. Leibniz's truths of fact or Hume's matters of fact. These were thought to be expansive or informative kinds of claims. They tell us more, like this would be the claim, this would be like just the claim that Travis is a bachelor. That is informative. It's not part of the nature of Travis to be a bachelor. It's not part of the nature of a bachelor to contain Travis. So When I learned that, that's something brand new that I couldn't have deduced just by thinking about the concepts involved. So here's another assumption that was going on prior to Kant, is this idea that the mind is just passive in our way of obtaining knowledge about the world. And you see this, if you think about it with Descartes, with Locke, with Berkeley, they all talked about one way you can know that the world is that our knowledge of the world is real is when that knowledge comes to you sort of passively, when it impacts you. So it almost makes the mind, when you're experiencing external objects like trees, chairs, other people, and so on, as if your mind just does nothing but receives all the information. Kant is going to reject this claim as well. He's going to argue that in our observations of external objects, that in those kinds of perceptions, the mind is active. The mind does something. It's not just a passive receptacle. It's actively involved in making that perception what it is. And then thirdly, we've seen that knowledge all comes from one basic source, depending on who we're talking about, right? Descartes and Leibniz would say reason. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume would all say experience. And there's a sense in which what Kant is saying is actually it's both at the same time. Although there's another sense in which you could take Kant as basically saying it's both at the same time, but it's also really reason. Now, as I was saying, if Hume is correct about the way that we think about knowledge, then any knowledge of anything beyond one's immediate perceptions is impossible. And that's because there is no way to establish reasoning based on induction or cause and effect. So, one thing to take from this is that maybe if you buy 1, 2, and 3, what Hume is saying follows. What Kant is going to be doing is by overturning 1, 2, and 3 on the board here, he's essentially also saying this is why Hume is wrong and we are capable of having greater knowledge than just what's immediately before us. So, the exciting new category, as you can see by the title of the slide, is to combine synthetic knowledge with a priori knowledge. So, the way to solve Hume's problem is to recognize that there's a third possibility, a third kind of truth. A truth that is a synthetic, meaning that it's informative, it's expansive, it brings together things that are not true just by definition, and it's a priori, which means that it is, once again, not based on experience. It's something that the mind contains within itself. That it is something that tells us what is necessarily and universally true about the world. And this is what will make possible refuting skepticism and gives us a basis for now doing metaphysics that was all destroyed by Hume. So our synthetic a priori knowledge for Hume is our knight in shining armor. Why? Because it's both synthetic and it's a priori. It's synthetic, like I said, because it gives us informative, new information. But it's also a priori. It's something that we don't have to find in experience. It's something that the mind already contains within itself. So, one way to look at what Hume did is he showed that we can't find anything else. If you just look at what's given to us in experience, you can't figure out all sorts of things. Kant is going to argue, but Hume was looking too strictly at experience. If you look at reasoning more generally, or in a more fundamental way, you'll see that we do have the means to make those inferences. So, here's one that's in response to Hume. We didn't quite go over this aspect of Hume, but it was kind of implied in what we had already read. Hume wants to know, where do you get your idea of cause and effect? So this is kind of different than what our chapter, the thing that we stopped with. If we kept reading, we'd go into this. Hume says, you have no real idea of cause and effect. You just have the idea that one thing is constantly followed by another thing. That there's what he calls constant conjunction. So like if I strike a match and a fire is lit, and I say, did you observe cause and effect? A lot of you might say, yeah, I just saw cause and effect. Hume would say, no, you didn't. You just saw one event, a match being struck, and followed by a second event, a fire being ignited. But where's the cause and effect? Show me, where was that in your experience? If I take a bottle of perfume and I spray it in the room, and then the room smells nice, which is a much nicer example than another smell example I was going to give. Then I say the perfume caused the pleasant smell. And I say, did you observe the cause and effect? Hume would say, no, you don't. You just observed one event, the spraying, followed by another event, the smell. But you don't observe the causation. Causation is not in your experience. Kant wants to say that we do actually have an idea of causation. Hume was right that we don't get the idea from experience, but we do have this idea. So he gives an example. He says, here's something we all know. We all know that everything that happens has a cause. So think about this. If all of a sudden the roof collapsed, thankfully none of us were hurt, would any of you turn around and just say, well, there's no reason for that. Sometimes roofs collapse and there was no basis for it. Or would you turn around and say, there must have been some construction problems or damage done or something that caused the roof to weaken so that it falls? I would venture to wager all of you would say that the first thing is just absolutely crazy. It's the second thing that makes sense. There's a reason why roofs collapse. They don't just collapse for no reason. If you go out to your car and it doesn't start, you don't think, well, things just take place and there's no cause or no basis for why stuff happens sometimes. You go out and you turn your key and it just goes and never turns over. Your response is, there must be some reason for this. Is the battery dead? Is the fuel, am I out of gas? Is there some other mechanical problem with the starter? Am I in the right car? Those would be all the kinds of questions you'd be asking, right? We all understand that everything happens has a cause. And we bring that to experience. So here's sort of a taste of what Kant is doing. We don't learn this proposition through experience. Hume, that's something Hume got right. We don't get it from experience. We bring it instead, Kant would say, to experience. The way that we understand experience is on the presupposition that we already get that everything that happens has a cause. Here's another example of a synthetic a priori knowledge. And a controversial one, but it's Kant's favorite. So 7 plus 5 equals 12. Kant thinks that mathematics, pretty much all mathematics, is synthetic a priori knowledge. Why? Because the concept of the union of 7 and 5 does not contain within it the concept of 12. But we can all do 7 plus 5 equals 12. Apart from we can understand this a priori truth, that the joining of 7 things and the joining of 5 things yields this new concept of 12ness. And 12, the concept of 12 is not contained within 7 and 5. Or the union of 7 and 5. So every time you do mathematics, every time you do even basic addition, that involves synthetic a priori knowledge. And Kant says this might be more evident as you use larger numbers. Because sometimes, this is what some people think, is that when you think of the union of 7 and 5, you're thinking of like 7 dots and 5 dots. And if you really, and then you kind of like, the 7 dots are here and the 5 dots are here. So you put them together, and then the 7 make 12 dots, right? So you might think the union of 7 and 5 really do make 12. But think about this. Now do a simple mathematical addition like 100 plus 200. You get 300. Do you think of 100 dots and 200 dots, and the joining of those together gives you 300 dots? No, that's not how we do that. You grasp that mathematical truth without some kind of representation like that. It's the joining of these concepts in a different way. So, Kant would say by doing mathematics, we're arriving at new knowledge. And maybe there's some people might be able to attest to something like this. The first time you start doing mathematics, you might even be sort of surprised to discover certain things add up to being certain numbers. Like you're sort of surprised, wow, 7 plus 5 is, oh my gosh, it's 12. Amazing. The only way that you could have that reaction is if 12 was not contained in the concept of 7 plus 5. Questions about this? Does this make sense, or am I just going on like a crazy person?
I don't have that reaction.
Which reaction?
That it's like I'm surprised that usually after I do it, it becomes like just like self-evident.
Now Kant's cool with that. Like he definitely wants to say there's some kind of self-evident and necessary aspect to this as well. And maybe to have that surprise, that sort of like, oh wow, it's actually this sum. Maybe that involves like when you're younger, when you first do it. Maybe the problem is that you're so accustomed to doing it now that it's like a second nature. Just in the same way as like right now, you're not really surprised to discover that like Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania. But maybe like a young child, the first time they learn that, it is surprising. Or there is sort of like, if like they have an aunt or an uncle who lives there, they're like, oh, that's where my, how cool. I don't know. Not a lot rides on that intuition. It's more on, the bigger one is whether you think the concept of 12 is contained in the concept of 7 plus 5. So far, though, this example, everything that happens as a cause does tell us about the world. So that would be synthetic a priori knowledge about reality. This example of 7 plus 5 equals 12, maybe you don't think is that informative about the way the world works. Well, let me hold off on this before I get to some of the other examples. So if Kant is right about the reality of synthetic a priori knowledge, it follows then that Leibniz and Hume are wrong about the way we acquire knowledge. So Leibniz thought that all knowledge could be established through logical deduction. He thought everything could be established using a priori analytic reasoning. Hume thought skepticism was true because we cannot establish knowledge based on cause and effect through reason, analytic a priori knowledge, or experience, synthetic a posteriori knowledge. If there is this third category that nobody has explored, then this would show that there is the possibility of having real metaphysical knowledge, of extending our knowledge beyond the narrow scope of experience. Let me pause for a moment before we talk about space and time. Just ask, are there any questions about synthetic a priori knowledge and what role it's playing? It'll be a little bit more clear how, after we do the space and time bit, it's going to be a little more clear how this plays a role in our knowledge of the world. The cause and effect example might be a good one to think about for now. Our understanding of cause and effect is a synthetic a priori knowledge. It is an example of synthetic a priori knowledge. It's the way in which we're able to, it's a presupposition that we bring to experience. It's how experience actually is it's the way that experience is not just a blur of ideas, but we manage to do something intelligible with experience. So you don't learn cause and effect, or all causes, all events, everything that happens has a cause. It's rather you already understand that, and that's why when things happen in the world, we're able to reason about it in certain ways. So let's talk about space and time. Two things that we want to try to establish, what Kant wants to establish with space and time. First, we want to show that space and time constitute what he calls the sensible forms of experience. What does he mean by that? It's like the framework by which experience takes place. The framework in which we have experience. And secondly, to show that space and time are not features of reality, but are only forms of sensibility. In other words, to use what we talked about earlier, those categories of thinking, that space and time are realities for the phenomena, but they're not realities of the noumena, the way the world is in itself. Space and time only apply to the world of appearances, the world of thought and experience. Now, to contrast Kant, maybe it's helpful to compare him to two other very prominent views of space and time, Leibniz and Newton. Newton thought that space and time exist in a real, absolute, and necessary way. That space and time do not depend on the existence of humans. So, Newton thought that space, the world having a three-dimensional space and is extended infinitely is necessarily true. And that space is this way whether we think about it or not. So the reality, the objective reality of space and time does not depend on us in any way. Leibniz, on sort of the complete other end of this, thought that space and time are constructions of human perceptions. That he doesn't think that the world really has space or time in it, that it's really just a measure of the subjective experiences that we have of particular things. And this is all related to, if you think back to the monadology and what he was saying about monads, that space, that physical objects aren't, in a sense, real, that they're more like these real appearances, or these nice illusions like rainbows. In the same way, space and time, they're only real insofar as they're helpful as constructions to understanding our experiences. But they don't really. If we didn't exist, there would be no space and time. Kant is going to have sort of a middle view between these two. Questions about what I'm saying about Newton or Leibniz? I'm going to try, and you'll see in a few more of these slides, not just in space and time, but with the final wrap up with this. I'm trying to help you see Kant in terms of how he compares to a lot of these other thinkers. I hope the comparisons make it clear what his view is. So he's not like Newton or Leibniz. So here are a bunch of quotes about space and time from our text. And all I did is find, when I have these numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, if you look on these pages, he literally just numbers these. Number 1, 2, 3, 4. And you'll notice a parallelism between 1 and 2 and what 4 and 5 for space correspond, 3 and 4 for space correspond to 4 and 5 for time. Time is a little different in the third thing, in that time is different than space in one important aspect. Space, for Kant, is something that only applies to our thoughts about space, physical objects. Whenever you have to represent reality, the external reality, the reality of a physical world, you need to have space. But if you just want to think about thoughts, if you just want to think about a unicorn, well, even forget it. You want to think about virtue, something that's not physical. Just think about virtue. You don't need space to represent virtue. You just can think about the concept. But you still need the passage of time. You can't think about virtue without there being some temporal component to your thought. Let me go through a couple of these things. I'm not necessarily going to cover all of this, but let's just take a look at the first one. Space is not an empirical concept that has been abstracted from outer experiences. Notice time is the same. Time is not an empirical concept that has been extracted from any experience. Kant is saying that you don't have an experience of space. Or you don't have an experience of time itself. What you have an experience of are physical objects within the framework of space, but you can't find space itself in your experience. So that you can't you can't see what space is. You only see things that are already in space. Likewise, you don't experience time itself. You experience the passage of time through events. But once again, you don't get that direct, immediate understanding of time. He says that space is a necessary a priori representation that underlies all outer intuitions. And likewise, time is a necessary representation that underlies all, not just the outer intuitions, but all intuitions. Once again, space and time are not things that we learn from experience. It's not like you get the concepts of space and time from experience. The way Kant thinks about it is that space and time are something that your mind already, the way he will put it later, these are categories of thought that your mind already has. Your mind, you're not born with innate knowledge, according to Kant. What you're born with are innate categories for understanding things. So you're not born with the idea of space, but your mind is born, when you're born, your mind is already equipped with the capacity such that when you have experiences, to fill those experiences with space and time. You don't get space and time from experience. It's almost the other way around. Experiences get their reality from your mind supplying space and time to them. I was going to skip over the rest of these for the time being, but the same kind of point that he's getting at is that space and time are something that our minds, they're not found in experience. It is something our mind supplies about experience. And furthermore, space and time have the structures that they have necessarily. They couldn't be different in any other way. And that's important for Kant. Because when he says that your mind supplies these ideas, he doesn't mean to say, therefore, it's illusory, or therefore we can't know reality. His point is that rather the opposite. Since your mind supplies this necessary framework for knowledge, that's how we can know things for certain. That's actually how we are able to have knowledge of things. And then he draws these conclusions. Once again, direct quotes from your text. The A, B, and C are things, once again, that are directly found in the text itself here. So I'm just kind of highlighting some parallels he's drawing about space and time. So he says about space, that space represents no property whatsoever of any things in themselves, nor does it represent things in themselves in their relation to one another. Time is not something that is self-subsistent or that attaches to things as an objective determination, and that hence would remain if one abstracted from all subjective conditions of our intuitions of it. Both of those things are saying essentially this. Space and time are not aspects of reality apart from our thoughts. Space and time are only things that apply to what our thought, to what we are thinking about. Space, he says, is nothing by the mere form of all appearances of outer senses. It is the subjective condition of sensibility under which alone outer intuition is possible for us. And time is nothing but the form of inner sense, of the intuiting we do of ourselves and of our inner state. And then time is different from space in that it is the a priori condition for all thought, all appearances. Whereas space, once again, is just about visual experience, physical representation. Here's a summary here. Space and time are a priori intuitions. They are a priori because they are not derived from experience. Once again, you don't have an experience of space. You have an experience of objects that fill space. But you don't have, nothing in your experience is space itself. Same thing goes for time. Your concept that you don't have an experience of time itself. What you have are experiences of events that flow through time. So, our knowledge of space and time can't be derived from experience. Therefore, they must be a priori. There must be something innate within us. But not innate like an idea. Once again, innate like a category, like a way to categorize thought or a way to understand thought. And they are also called intuitions because we have an immediate, non-conceptual awareness of them. Which means that these are things that we have in thought, but not because we reason about them or because we conceptualize them. Once again, it's like they're prerequisites for us being able to conceptualize and think about other things. So, how is this different from Newton and Leibniz? Space and time are not reducible to our experience, contrary to Leibniz. Leibniz would say that space and time don't have any objective reality to them, and they could be different than what we think about them. If we thought about them differently, space and time would be different. Kant is saying, no, space and time have a necessary structure that is not just reducible to the relations of things in our experiences. And therefore, there is something objective and real about space and time, contrary to Leibniz. However, unlike Newton, he's also saying that space and time are not real in an absolute sense, meaning that they don't apply to things outside of the way we think about them. They only exist in our minds as they are attached to things we think about, to subjects. So space and time are necessary prerequisites to have perceptions and thoughts about objects. If you think, this is another way to think about what he's doing here. Can you imagine having thoughts about things without them being in space or time? Like, could you imagine a table? Like, can you think about the table apart from space and time? The answer seems to be no. If I think about a table, it's got to be spatially represented, and there's a flow of time as I'm thinking about it. I can't form a thought about the table independent of space or time. So for any kind of representation of the world, you can't do that representation apart from space and time. And then for any thought period in general, you can't have thoughts without there being time. All of your ways of thinking involve the flow of time to them. You can't take that away. Hence, space and time are not things you learn from experience. Space and time are things that you already need to have in your mind in order to have experiences, or to understand them, or to think about them. Does that make a little bit of sense about what I'm saying about your mind shaping the world now? Your mind comes equipped with the categorization of space and time. If your mind didn't already have that way of categorizing thought, then when you have these experiences of like tables, desks, chairs, and other people, it would just be this mess of information that your mind, if your mind did nothing but receive the information, your mind wouldn't know what to do with that. It would just be this blur of information coming in. What Kant is saying is your mind isn't just passively receiving the information from your senses. It's that when your senses bring all this stuff into your mind now has within itself this way of organizing, categorizing, and sort of ordering all the experiences that you are having so that they are intelligible, so that you're capable of thinking about it. Because all the stuff that's being brought to you through experience isn't enough by itself. There must be something additionally brought to those experiences that enables you to think about it. We'll have more to say about that little bit I just did, but that's me trying to tie all this together here. Are there questions about his views of space and time?
Yeah, when he says that, you can't get the idea of time through, experience or, empiricism. I know there have been times in my life where when I went to sleep, I closed my eyes, and it didn't seem like any time later, and I woke up and it was, hours later. How can you explain that? Because clearly I got the evidence afterwards to know that there was time going on in that period, but my mind didn't experience it. I don't know.
So, are you saying kind of where you kind of nod off, you don't quite realize, when you wake up you don't realize hours have passed?
No, I went to bed, and I felt like I closed my eyes, and then it was 8 hours later when I woke up.
I think, this is what I might, in that case, of course, you're not experiencing the flow of time at all, in a way. And Kant, the cool thing about him is that he would say that you need to have experience. It's you need to have both the experience needs to be there for these categories of your mind to be put to work. So if you don't have any experiences, if you fall asleep and that, then your mind can't do anything. We're going to have to say more about that pretty soon. So you need to have the experiences plus the mind. In a way, he's kind of faulting people like Leibniz and Descartes because they put so much on the idea that the mind can do it on its own. He's going to say, no, the mind can't do it all on its own, but neither can experience do it all on its own either. You got to have both.
Okay. I was just wondering, because the only way I knew time had passed is when I looked at the clock or looked outside and saw that time had passed. I was just wondering how that fit into this.
I think in that kind of case, it wouldn't be, he doesn't have anything unique to say about that. What he would say is more about the way that we feel the flow of time happening just right now is different. Because the empiricist would say you experience the flow of time. And what Kant would say is you don't actually really experience the flow of time. What you experience is, what you're getting through immediate experience right now is just one event followed by another event followed by another. The flow of time is supplied by your mind that is the way of making sense of all these experiences. It's the underlying presupposition in your thought, but it's not the object of thought. Other thoughts about space and time? Wormholes. Stargates. Let's take a little break here, and we'll pick up when the old clock says 7:30. Let's say 7:33. So to see how space and time are supposed to tie in with this synthetic a priori knowledge, this bridge that is supposed to make knowledge possible for Kant, let's take a look at the left column on 736. He says, time and space are accordingly two sources of cognition. From these sources we can draw a priori different synthetic cognitions, as is shown above, all by the splendid example that pure mathematics provides in regards to our cognitions of space and its relations. And that's just in reference to the idea of geometry. So once again, you can deduce things in geometry, and those deductions presuppose space. So space, once again, is enabling us to extract new knowledge, informative information, but it doesn't do so through experience. It's a priori synthetic knowledge. Keep reading here. He says, for time and space taken together are pure forms of all sensible intuition. and thereby make synthetic propositions possible a priori. But precisely thereby, by being merely conditions of sensibility, these a priori sources of cognition determine their own limits. Namely, they determine that they apply to objects merely insofar as they are regarded as appearances, but do not exhibit things in themselves. Appearances are the sole realm where the a priori sources of cognition are valid. If we go outside that realm, there's no further objective use that can be made of them. This limited reality of space and time leaves the reliability of experiential cognition otherwise untouched. For we have equal certainty in that cognition, whether these forms necessarily attach to things in themselves or only to our intuition of those things. So, space and time are an example of synthetic a posteriori knowledge. Synthetic a priori knowledge, in that they give the framework for thought. They're not parts of experience. It's that contribution your mind takes to experience that gives experience structure, form, the ability to think about it. And therefore, one of the things he stresses here is that space and time are necessary objective features of appearances, but that doesn't mean that they apply to the way reality is apart from our minds. If you want to ask Kant, what is reality like apart from the way we think about it, he's just going to tell you we can't know that. All we can know is the reality of experience, the reality that we perceive, the reality that we think about. But when you try to think about how are things independent of our thoughts, we're incapable of having those thoughts. Questions either about, you could ask about this passage, you could ask it about space and time, or more generally what I'm trying to drive home with this big picture of Kant. There's a little bit, I think the next thing I'm going to go into is actually really helpful, but I once again just want to give you the opportunity to ask anything about Kant here. It can be about a specific thing you read that I haven't addressed, anything at all. I find that if I wait to give you these opportunities till the very end of class, people will just stare at the clock and say, let us out. So, if you really do have a question about this, this would be a great time to ask. Yeah?
Did anybody, talk more about this? Like any other philosophers, keep going with this? Or is this kind of what everybody thinks is true right now?
You know, there are different schools of thought. So after Kant was a philosopher named Hegel. And Hegel sort of develops more of what Kant is doing about it all being idealistic. So that there is constantly the changing of ideas and that it's sort of all, once again, more of an idealism. There's another kind of group of philosophers that took this in a more, some would say in a more sane direction, that seems more or less kind of what we have more today. But there still are pretty significant debates today about, for one, most people today don't buy into synthetic a priori knowledge. So most people think that I would say most philosophers today reject that Kant succeeded in establishing that. The other thing, though, that is interesting is to think about to what extent we do have, is there any kind of a priori knowledge whatsoever. So there's still quite a bit of debate on that front. There are still some philosophers today who think everything is purely from experience. And so things like all bachelors are unmarried or all red things are colored things, they might say, well, maybe we'll prove those are not true someday. It's not something you can know a priori. Maybe experience will overturn it. Yeah?
Can't you say, though, that people created the term bachelor, so therefore, you do gain it through experience, I guess, because it's kind of an idea that you created. Marriage wasn't a thing that just was. People created that idea.
So this is, so there's kind of 2 points here. One is and I think most people today would agree that you're not just born with the concept of bachelor. And Kant would agree with that as well. Or whether you start talking about bachelors or talking about triangles. that triangles are, Kant would say, you're not born knowing what a triangle is. You learn the concept through experience. But the question is, once you have the concept, what can you deduce or what can you do once it is something you understand? Now, the other point you're making is more interesting today that people are talking about, which is to what extent does language and does society shape our concepts? So like marriage would be a great one, right? Something that we're struggling with in our nation right now, which is, there are some people who think marriage is one definite sort of objective definition, and certain unions don't match that, therefore they're not marriages. And then there are other people who say, well, maybe we should think about marriage differently. And what you essentially have here are competing two different ideas. One that says definitions about concepts are set. They can't change. So there's something that lies outside of that, it can never match. There's another group of people who say, well, maybe we should change our concept. Maybe concepts are socially formed things.
Right.
Another kind of more radical way to put this, and once again, some people take Kant to be saying something like this. It's a famous hypothesis put forward called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is the idea that our concepts shape reality. So the way that you think about things makes things what they are. And I've talked about this a little bit in this class as well. In the metaphysics class, I showed that video of the Himba tribe, which is kind of cool, where they have different ways of thinking about colors than we do. Like they're raised having a different set of color experiences. In fact, Alex, were you the one who shared this with me initially?
I don't know. I think I told you about it.
Anyway, so they have a hard time discriminating between colors we easily do. Like if you put up a shade of red and a shade of blue, we easily say, oh, these are different colors. You put those exact same cards up before people who've been raised in this African tribe, they have a very hard time telling those two colors apart. Because in their conceptual scheme, the way they've been raised, those are really similar colors. They fall under the same name. They're the same color even. But you show them very fine shades of green, they can easily tell them all apart. Because in the way they were raised, those all have different names to them. The way I've tried to kind of express this before in this class is the idea of, like, if all you think about with music, like, if you just think, like, so imagine somebody who's, like, really steeped in classical music. They understand the difference between, like, Baroque music, romantic classical music. They understand. They have a very fine-grained understanding of different forms of classical music. They have different ways of thinking about classical music than you might have. If you when you hear classical music, that's one category for you. That's all it is. It's one thing. Then you don't have as many. The way that you experience classical music is different from that way the other person experiences it, because they have more ways of categorizing it and thinking about it. Or maybe to use a different example, if that person who knows classical music, maybe when they hear like anything different, like they think of like rock, heavy metal, punk, alternative music, all of that to them sounds the same. But if you're familiar with this kind of music, you're like, well, all those things are actually really different. They're not the same. How could you think they're the same? To that person, though, it's all the same. The way that you think, the concepts you have shape the way that you perceive reality. Now, maybe the Brianna's point is more about to what extent. So Kant thought that every human being was equipped with the exact same concepts, the same categories. One direction people have taken with this is the thought that maybe we're not all the same. Maybe like these concepts or these categories are socially or culturally transferred. And so that maybe different cultures perceive things differently. For Kant, this idea isn't just about our perceptions of the world, it also has to do with our taste, with our sense of taste, beauty, ethics, all of those things as well. So once again, if all this is a matter of like what he would call pure reason, but for maybe if he turned out to be wrong about that and it was actually more about culturalization, that would have very different effects. Yeah.
My question was kind of having to do with the colors. Say there was a shade of color or a color that couldn't be perceived by humans, and never will be able to be. Would that be an example of like the world not conforming to our cognition? Or like
Well, so like ultraviolet light, for instance, we can't perceive.
okay.
We don't really have an idea of what ultraviolet light is like, I guess. But the ways that we do think about it, it still involves something that our mind contributes to that, because we think about it as having certain wavelengths of light. So how do we ultimately how do we conceive of wavelengths of light? It involves using space and time. So that is what your mind contributes to the understanding of those things.
Okay. Yeah.
Other questions or anything else from the text? I know actually most of you have spent a lot of time reading this, which was difficult. I hope the questions were actually helpful, that this wasn't just busy work, but that as you worked through that, that was helpful for you to understand what's going on. Any questions on here that anything else you'd like for me to try to address before we move on? We go beyond space and time. Step through the start gate. So the next section, this now takes us on to 737. These quotations are another interesting way to get at the big picture point that Kant is making. So Kant claims that all of our cognition, so all of our thought, is constituted both by intuition and by concepts. So there's something that sort of your mind supplies and something experience supplies. Here's the way that he puts this. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. So here's what he's saying is that if you were to have, so when he says thoughts without contents are empty, it's almost like saying, imagine your mind did not have these a priori categories for understanding thought, like space and time. If you lacked those categories for thinking about reality, and you had perceptions, you had thoughts, the problem is those thoughts would not find anywhere, like they couldn't be understood. It'd be like you'd be getting a mess of information and noise with no way of sorting it out. Without having the right concepts, those thoughts that you have amount to nothing. Now, if you have these intuitions, meaning like these a priori understandings like space and time, but you don't have experiences, you're as good as blind. Or actually, I think it's reversed here. Sorry, but thoughts without contents would be like you have the ability to categorize things, but you don't have experience. So if you have so if you have space and time, the ability to think in space and time, but you don't have any experiences, those categories are empty. The contents of your thought never are filled, so you wouldn't have a thought about space and time without anything else. But intuitions without concepts are blind. So if you have thoughts about the world, so if you were to have perceptions, but without having those innate categories that you're born with, you would have all this sensory information, but no way to categorize it, no way to think about it, and so you're as good as blind. He says the understanding cannot intuit anything. Only from their union can cognition arise. So on his view, you need to have both something contributed from experience and something contributed from your mind. And both things are actively working to create the way we think about the world. So if you just, to emphasize this one more time, if you just had experiences from the world and your mind did nothing, it wouldn't be intelligible. It would just be this cacophony of sensation that you wouldn't have any means of sorting it and understanding it and being able to intelligibly think about it. But if you have, on the other hand, all the machinery, all the content, of the conceptualization, the categorization that your mind is equipped with, but no experience, then you would have all the ability to think, but nothing to fill it with. All of your thoughts would still be empty. You need to have the experience to fill your mind with content. So it's got to have both of these things. So where we're going with this from 737 on is that he's now starting to lay out some of the way in which he thinks the mind has these categories, these concepts within it. So one of the things he brings up is that all judgment, or all knowledge involves judgment. But all judgments consist of a kind of logical form or function which requires the mind to supply categories in order for those thoughts to be represented in one's mind. How does this work? The mind actively applies categories to our sensations that provide structure and interpretation to them that make them intelligible thoughts to us. And this is what's going on when you start finding all these little diagrams, right? You see one on 739, you've got another one on 740, 741. He's laying out his framework of what he thinks your mind is doing when you form a judgment about the world. That those diagrams are instances of this logical form or function that your mind supplies when you make representations of things about the world. That you see things according to these kinds of categories, right? That you see things as either being universal, particular, or single. You see things that you make judgments about things that are either affirmative, negative, or infinite. That you see, and he gives all these different relations and modalities as well to try to describe the kinds of judgments that we make about things. These judgments, once again, are not the categories that your judgments fall under are not to be found in experience, but once again, it's what your mind supplies that makes experience intelligible. That gives you the capacity to make judgments about experience. Let's do a comparison now between some of the main philosophers we've looked at and Kant. Maybe this is a better way to understand what he's up to. So Locke. A lot of people like Locke, right? The empiricism resonates. So most people seem to really get what Locke is up to. Locke is essentially saying that substances and their primary qualities constitute reality. But of course we have to distinguish the way we think about reality, because that involves secondary qualities that are not really in things, compared to the substances and their primary qualities. Kant one way to see Kant is like he's saying no to that. Locke's reality, what he calls reality, only exists in our cognition of reality. What Locke is talking about is only the way we think about the world. We think about substances and properties, but we have to think about them, once again, using space and time. You don't get space and time from experience. But Locke, if you remember, would say all of our ideas, every object, every idea that is in the mind comes from experience. But you don't get, once again, the experience of space itself or of time itself, and that's the underlying reality behind all of our experiences. So what Locke is getting at isn't what reality is apart from the mind. He still is getting at what has to be part of the way we think about reality, not reality itself. Well, what about Berkeley? Kant is kind of an idealist, a transcendental idealist. How is he different from Berkeley? Berkeley would say that reality consists of nothing more than ideas existing in the minds of each perceiver. That all you have are ideas and perceivers, right? Kant is different in that Kant would say, no, our thoughts are not illusory, in the sense that Berkeley is going to have to say, is there anything that exists outside of us? According to Berkeley, no. Everything that exists within our minds. Kant thinks that would be a deceptive and radical illusion then. So, the sense in which, and this is a part of Kant's transcendental idealism, is that even though all we can know are our own thoughts, our thoughts are still directing us to the fact that something exists outside of us. Even though we can't know what it is, even though we don't know the way things are in and of themselves, that doesn't mean there is nothing external to us. Kant would still say there really is something that exists externally to our minds. So in that sense, Kant is different from Berkeley. Well, what's the difference between Kant and skepticism? Skeptics, so if you remember some of the arguments from Montaigne, some of the arguments Descartes gives in the first meditation, and of course the arguments given by Hume, they point out the fact that it's difficult to obtain knowledge of anything beyond one's own mind. Why is that? Because there are these skeptical possibilities out there. Right? Descartes would say, how do you know you're not dreaming right now? Hume would say, how do you know that tomorrow is going to be like the past? How do you know that the things we've yet to observe are going to be like those things we've already observed? For all you know, they could be different. Kant is different from that kind of skepticism in that he would say, actually, this might sound weird, but this skepticism just sort of says we don't know what the world, we're doubtful about the nature of the external world. Kant would say, actually, we can know for sure, like we've got certainty about this, and here's what we are certain about. Well, that we can't know the world as it is in itself. So the other people just say, we have no idea whether we can know what the world is like or not. Kant can almost say with definitiveness, yes, we can know that we don't know. We can know for sure that the way that the world appears to us must be a certain way, but the way that the world is apart from our thoughts is impossible to know. So, and here's the other part for Kant, is that we can know for sure that there is an external world, that there must be something for Kant that is giving us these ideas. It doesn't all come from within us. It just, even if we can't know the way that the world is in itself. Now, this might still seem like it's a little disappointing, right? And this maybe is my beef with Kant, is that for all of the work that he's supposed to be doing to try to get us to overcome skepticism, it still seems like we're stuck in the same problem that everyone else was giving us. Everyone else said, once you enter into the world of ideas, you can't get out of the world of ideas to understand the way the world is in and of itself. You don't know the way the world, you don't know if your way of thinking about the world corresponds to the way the world actually is. Well, for Kant, do we really get out of that problem? It doesn't sound like we do. It seems like Kant is just dressed up our minds, so that he's found a neat way for our minds to contain more than experience. Neato. So he's shown that that contrary to Hume, there is more to our way of thinking than just what experience gives us. But that still doesn't help us to have confidence or any kind of clue as to whether the way that we think corresponds to a reality independent of the way we think. And so, my criticism of Kant on this front would basically be then, even though he's not this kind of skeptic, he still gives us skepticism. We still don't get out of the key problem on the way that I would criticize. Questions about how Kant might be different from Locke, Berkeley, or some of the skeptics that we've looked at. How he's different from, I didn't put Leibniz up here, but questions about any of those comparisons. So, big picture things to take away from Kant. Once again, there's a sense in which he is rejecting both empiricism and rationalism. He is, I should say, leaning on the rationalist side because he says your mind has more than experience gives you. But he's not a rationalist like Descartes or Leibniz in that he doesn't think your mind already contains thoughts within it before experience. He thinks experience is what fills your mind with its content, but that your mind doesn't just passively receive the content, your mind is active in also contributing to those thoughts. So there's a sense in which he's doing something different than the empiricists and the rationalists we've studied. Secondly, that our mind plays an active role in shaping our cognitions of the world. So once again, that our minds are not just passively receiving the ideas that we have, but that our minds are doing something that contributes to the way that we have thought, that it adds to experience. And that the key thing for him is the way that we can have synthetic a priori knowledge which underlies our judgments about the world. Synthetic, once again, meaning it's expansive, it's informative, it gives us new information that's not already contained within the knowledge itself. And it's a priori, meaning it doesn't come from experience, it comes from the mind. And secondly, that structure it imposes is necessary and universal. So, synthetic a priori knowledge underlies our judgments about the world, which makes knowledge of our appearances of the world possible. If we didn't have that, we couldn't have any knowledge. Questions about Kant?
Okay, the first point you're saying he's rejecting both empiricism and rationalism. Does he have a name for his approach? I didn't know. Does he?
It's the big transcendental idealism. So.
Transcendental idealism.
Yeah, so that's what
the umbrella term for
yeah.
what he's saying.
Other questions about how to put this all together? Well, that's all I got for you tonight. So it's been a great semester. Y'all have been good troopers. And I'll see some of you at the final exam. And others of you, I'll say have a great summer.
Likewise.